everyone, and welcome to this podcast, which is going out as part of the 2024 Early Music at Newcastle Festival. I'm Joe Lockwood, Leverhulme Trust Early Career Research Fellow here at Newcastle University, and I'm joined in conversation for this episode by Ellen T. Harris, Professor Emerita of Music at MIT in Boston, Massachusetts. Ellen is a leading scholar of the music of G.F. Handel, and the author of numerous wonderful and well-known books and articles on the composer, including Handel as Orpheus, Voice and Desire in the Chamber Cantatas, which came out with Harvard University Press in 2001, and the biography George Friedrich Handel, A Life with Friends, published by Norton in 2014. Some of my current research explores the various afterlives Handel's music experienced in the years after the composer's death, as it made its way beyond Britain and across the globe. Since we're approaching Holy Week and Easter, and therefore also lots of performances of Handel's oratorio Messiah here in Britain and in America, we took this opportunity in our short conversation to speak about one interesting strand of Messiah's reception history in America in the 18th century and now, the tradition of standing up for the famous Hallelujah chorus at the end of the oratorio's second part. Our discussion takes in the politics of Messiah in its early performances, the origins of the tradition of standing for Hallelujah and the tradition's own political resonances, how that tradition was negotiated when it arrived in revolutionary America, and how it's maintained and thought about in Boston today. So, here I am now with Ellen. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Professor Ellen Harris to join me now in a conversation that follows on from one that began at the Handel Institute conference in London at the end of last year. That conversation was completely fascinating to me, and I'm really excited to be able to carry on with it now. What we began speaking about then was something I think a lot of listeners will likely have some experience of, partly since it concerns what, as I think you've surely absolutely correctly written, Ellen, may be the best known piece of classical music ever written. That's the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's oratorio Messiah. What we were speaking about specifically was the tradition of audiences standing up, rising to their feet for this movement in performances of Messiah and for the chorus when it's performed as a standalone number. I'd been speaking at the conference about some of my research about the earliest history of the performance and reception of Handel's music in America, in Boston and New York during the colonial period, the time of the Revolution, and the period immediately following the colonies becoming independent. And through that work, I'd found out that this tradition of standing up for Hallelujah was part of the chorus's performance culture in America right from the start. This was really interesting to me because it was also the case that Americans at that time recognized that the tradition had its origins, along with Handel's music itself, of course, in Britain, and that it had some political meanings attached to it in that British context. And they found themselves having to negotiate those political meanings in the context of what was going on in terms of the relationship between America and Britain at the time. That's to say, the Revolution and independence. What you pointed out, Ellen, when we began speaking about this previously, was that the tradition is still very much a living one in America today, just as it is in certain contexts in Britain. And the question that I think really interested us both is, what do people understand themselves to be doing today when they stand up for Hallelujah? If they understand themselves to be participating in a tradition by doing that, what does that tradition mean for them? And does what they're doing now have anything to do with what was going on when this tradition was first established in America in the 18th century? So you're an absolutely ideal conversation partner to be talking about this subject, and because you're both an expert in the relationship between Handel's music and the politics of culture more broadly, and a Bostonian. I wondered if we might be able to begin just by talking a little bit about the politics of Messiah in its first performances. I know that you've written a little bit suggesting some of the connections that Jennings's Messiah libretto might have with contemporary political debates and issues in British culture at the time. You write that Jennings's decision to precede the Hallelujah chorus with texts of military victory suggests that, as in Israel and Egypt, the text of Messiah refers to war with Spain, the contemporary concerns that France would join with Spain in Catholic opposition, and a belief that God's Son would intervene and save his people, who were understood in general to be Protestants.
Yes, British Protestants, I think, in particular. Yes, Church of England, as opposed to Scotch Presbyterians. Or Scottish Presbyterians, I should be saying. Yes, I mean, the Hallelujah chorus comes at it's such a climactic moment at the end of part 2 of the work, and it does arrive, as you've quoted me as saying, that after a number of military movements, we hear, "Why do the nations rage?" And then we hear, "Thou shalt break them in pieces with a rod of iron." So it's almost a violent beginning to the Hallelujah chorus. So the Hallelujah chorus feels like a victory chorus, and it has been described as a coronation anthem for God, which I understand it really has to do. It's an interesting connection between politics in England at the time and religion. And Jennings is working here very, very much to combat feelings of deism in England at this time, and the idea that God, simply started the world as a clockwork orange and then let it be. And so the Messiah is constantly talking about miracles. It's talking about God in the world, that God is present in the world. I think this is important. And the whole question of prophecy, of course, is enormously important to Messiah, and of prophecy being fulfilled, which is so much of what parts 1 and 2 are about. And so much of parts 1 and 2 are Old Testament prophecy, which is being used to describe the fulfillment. And I think all of those things are very important to Jennings, but I think that the deism and the contemporary feeling of that is threaded through a political message, and the sense that Britain still stands in danger, certainly, of war with its Catholic neighbors. And the Catholic neighbors being not just France, but of course Spain, and to a certain extent the Austrian Empire. So we have Britain feeling very much vulnerable, because there's certainly been a great deal of war going on. I mean, it's almost constant. I think from the time of the late 17th century, there are very few patches where there is not some kind of European war going on, and not a war that has some aspect of Protestant versus Catholicism, and some worry about a Catholic takeover after the Protestant succession that was established and then, of course, happened in 1714. So that the feeling of conquering that, and at the same time, the sense that this is God in the world standing behind the British, and that the British, I think, have always seen themselves, well, in Handel's oratorios at any rate, I think the British see themselves as the chosen people, that they are the direct descendants of the biblical Israelites, and that God will, if God be for us, as we get to in the third part, who can be against us? And the intersection of politics and religion, which is enormously important to Great Britain at this period, is, I think, an essential element of Messiah and in Jennings' creation of the libretto.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful background, I think, in lots of ways, to introducing to our discussion the earliest source that we have for the tradition of standing up for the Hallelujah chorus.
Yes.
coming, as it does, in a letter by the Scottish essayist and poet James Beattie, quite a few years later in 1780. But what Beattie writes about this tradition is when the chorus struck up, and he's speaking here about an imagined first or early performance of Messiah. When the chorus struck up, the audience were so transported that they all, together with the king, who happened to be present, started up and remained standing till the chorus ended, and hence it became the fashion in England. You will agree with me that this does great honour to Handel, to music, and to the English nation. So it seems to me that this formulation is working to link together Handel's music, religious devotion, royalism, and British nationalism in a way that kind of replicates lots of the things that were going on in the politics of Messiah's libretto itself in its first performance contexts, and as events like the Westminster Handel commemorations were going to continue to create in the 1780s. Is that anecdote actually true, though? My impression is that it can't be, because if the king had been in attendance at an early London performance of Messiah, we'd know about it, and there's no record of that ever having taken place.
I mean, I'm not even sure from this letter which king we're talking about.
George II.
It is George II specifically.
Yeah.
So during Handel's lifetime.
Yes.
I mean, I've always understood this very much as kind of anecdote that has limited historical value. It comes much after the date that it says it occurred. I mean, I've always understood it that the king stood up, and therefore everyone had to, because that is, in fact, in a monarchy, what one does. If the king stands up, then everyone stands up. Don't sit in the king's presence. Although it doesn't sound as if it's stated exactly that way. It says that the king and everyone stood up, as if it was all in one motion together, not the king standing up and then everyone following.
Yes, the causal relationship isn't there in the...
No, not at all. In fact, that's how I've always understood it. So now this is being corrected for me. So thank you. This is very, very helpful. In Boston, I'm talking now specifically about the Handel and Haydn performances, although we have many performances of Messiah in Boston every Christmas. It's always at Christmas by many organizations. And the two that I know the best are Handel and Haydn and Boston Baroque. But in the Handel and Haydn performances, if we go back to the period when Christopher Hogwood was the director, he actually tried to get the Boston audiences not to stand up. He felt that it had a negative impact on the beginning of the movement, which actually begins in a rather quiet way and builds. And if everyone is shuffling around and standing up, you miss that. You don't really hear it well, unless you have one of these orchestrally adapted versions that begins with a cymbal crash or something. Yes, that's probably the right way to perform it if everyone is going to stand up. But he explained it in the way that I've always understood it, that, I mean, this was actually in all the programs. This was a box that said, the tradition derives from an event that is said to have occurred with George II standing up, and then everyone else followed after him. The problem is we have no idea why George II stood up, if in fact this happened. And whether it was in honor of the peace or in honor of God or simply because he had a leg cramp is unclear. And I think, some of this was actually in the note, which I would have to go back and do archival research and give you the proper note that was in the programs. But people took offense to this note. I can only trace my own history with the work. As a child, standing up for the Hallelujah Chorus for me was a great deal of fun. It was sort of like, oh, wow, we all get to stand up now. And it really didn't matter at all to me. Just sort of like, now we can all stand up.
Stretch your own legs.
But it had nothing to do with anything in particular, just that this was a tradition that happened. And so, yes, this is fun. We'll stand up. And for me, in my head, there certainly was no religious, no political, certainly no royal significance to it. But in Boston, when people were asked to consider this, Christopher Hogwood was very clear that you could do what you wanted and that they were not actually patrolling this, but that people should understand what the tradition was and make a choice knowing what the tradition was of standing up. And I think the reaction to that was in some ways the reverse of what he wanted, because people got very adamant about we stand up. It has nothing to do with George II. We stand up for the peace, for the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, for God triumphant. It feels to me increasingly in performances that I've attended, and the last one just last December, that there is a kind of reverence to it. People are not standing up defiantly. They're actually standing up because it feels very religious to them. It feels that this is a moment of transcendent religious acceptance, basically, that we are all standing together. It's a moment of community. And so I don't like standing up, actually, now. As a child, I loved it, jumped up first, and now I really don't want to stand up. I really want everyone to sit in their seats. I want to hear the beginning of the Hallelujah chorus quietly, and I frequently don't. I frequently sit in my seat and just let everyone stand around me. And I do get very, people do look. And I don't know whether they think, perhaps they actually are thinking that I'm being irreligious, that I am being in some ways an opponent of, taking a stand by not standing. That if you're in church and everyone stands for the hymns or for whatever sections of the service one would stand for, certainly the hymns, you stand up. If you don't do that in church, it is somewhat a faux pas. And I have the sense when I'm in a very large audience in Symphony Hall listening to the Hallelujah chorus, that there is that sense that you're doing something wrong by not standing up. I don't think Chris ever managed to get this sense of you can do whatever you want. And it may be that it built a stronger feeling to stand up than had existed previously. And I'm wondering whether I need to just change my attitude and just stand up with everyone, because it is a community. Whether there's any religion, there certainly is no politics. But if there's any religion involved in it, it's a community religion. And I think maybe I just need to stand up and get over it.
That's all absolutely fascinating. Fascinating to hear as well that religion is really at the heart of what people take themselves to be doing when they participate in that tradition in Boston now. It seems to me to connect really fascinatingly with what people in some of the earliest Boston performances of this music in the 18th century thought that they were doing when they participated in this tradition, which they were inheriting then from Britain, of standing up for the Hallelujah chorus. Some of those earliest performances in Boston took place in 1786 and 1787 at the King's Chapel, and they were charitable events, fundraisers, more or less, in aid of the rebuilding efforts after the siege of Boston, which had really knocked the city about during the Revolutionary War, and in support of a town that was really suffering the results of the huge economic crisis which hit all of the newly independent United States in those first years after independence. Public and private debt spiraling, inflation out of control, the states imposing enormously punitive taxation regimes to try and get that debt crisis under control, all of those sorts of things. There were performances which very much took place against that background of the aftermath of independence. So in that context, it's really interesting to me to read some advice that the Boston Gazette gave people who are about to attend one of these performances in January 1787. They let their readers know, at the performance of this divine chorus, that's to say the Hallelujah chorus, it's usual for the whole audience to rise from their seats and be upon their feet the whole time, in testimony of the humble adoration of the supreme governor of the universe, our great and universal parent. And what seems to me absolutely fascinating about that is that, just I think in a very similar way to what you've just been describing to me, they're asserting at once their ownership of that tradition as Bostonians and
Yes.
the religiosity. That's really what they're wanting to emphasize. They're wanting to emphasize this is about religion and not politics. But by asserting that, they're actually actively working to suppress or overwrite a particular political interpretation, one to do with the king and British nationalism.
There's a political element to this because there is a sense, just as Protestants said they had a direct connection to God and did not have to go through the Pope or any kind of hierarchy, they could speak directly to God. The king, as sort of the God representative on earth, I think that in part the Bostonians are saying they're overthrowing that. They have overthrown that. They now have a direct line to God and very much taking the position that they are the chosen people and that this piece is for them and represents for them that sense that they don't need an intermediary with their God. I can imagine standing up and feeling very much a sense of triumph after the revolution. That this is, again, it comes after all of these texts. Why do the nations rage so furiously together? And thou shalt break them in pieces, right? With a rod of iron. And then hallelujah. And the Americans are told they must stand up at this point. To me, it sounds celebratory. So it has a political cast, I think, as well as the religious cast that you mentioned, which I think today the religious cast is far more important, although Americans still have something of this belief of being the chosen people. But we're not going to get into that. I don't think there's any sense of military triumph today, but certainly there is a sense. It's astounding to me how much the text of the Messiah, the libretto that Jennens put together, speaks to us today as if it was written today. So when we go through texts like Why do the nations rage so furiously, there is a sense of the horrors that are going on in the world today have not dissipated, have, if anything, grown. We have Ukraine, we have the Hamas attack in Israel, and now Israel's bombing of Gaza, and it almost makes your head explode. And not to mention so many things going on elsewhere, and I'm not going to list them all. And the feeling that maybe in time, this will end. There is in Messiah and in the text in Messiah a sense of such comfort that in some way, somehow, it will come right. And we will be personally forgiven. And ultimately, when we know that our Redeemer liveth, that we too shall live. I just think the whole sense of comfort that Messiah brings, and I think brought when it was first written, interestingly brought comfort to the early Americans in 1787, and I think brings comfort in 2024 in our world today. And so I think that sense of standing up as a community in Boston is not something that I should sneer at. I think, as I said, I think maybe next year, maybe this December,
you'll consider standing up.
Stand up. Yes.
Thank you so much for being part of this conversation today, Ellen. It's been absolutely fascinating throughout, and I'm very grateful indeed.
Well, thank you for explaining to me exactly what the story is in the letter, which in fact, I think I had wrong. So I've learned something. Thank you very much, Joe.